Hello and welcome to this video where I'll be giving you some revision on one of the areas from the VAT area of the Advanced Tax UK syllabus that students can sometimes find challenging. My name's Aileen Edgar and I'm an expert ACCA Advanced Tax tutor. Today we'll be looking at the situation where we have a business that's making both taxable and exempt supplies and how we decide how much of the input tax it suffers can be reclaimed from HMRC. I'm going to use some summaries and a short example to help you have more clarity over this issue. First of all, let's cover some VAT basics. When you were studying tax previously, whether that be at university or as part of the ACCA taxation exam, you would only have been dealing with businesses that made taxable supplies, so those were standard rate of VAT of 20%, such as car sales, or the zero rate of VAT applied for essential food, for example. Or a business that only made exempt supplies, so where VAT is not chargeable at all, such as an educational organisation. Now, at advanced tax, we can consider a business that's making both taxable and exempt supplies. That could be, for example, an optician business where contact lenses, for example, are standard rated, but a sight test is exempt. That business will buy in a number of items to help run its trade, suffering input tax on those purchases, and then they could be used to support both taxable and exempt supplies. Often overheads fall into this category, so things like stationery costs, for example. Now, if a VAT registered business is making only taxable supplies, it can reclaim input tax that it suffered on the items it has bought into the business to help make those taxable supplies. If it's only making exempt supplies, however, then it would not be able to reclaim any input VAT. In this session, we're going to look at how we deal with such businesses and work out how much input tax can actually be reclaimed from those purchases. Overall, we have got 3 tests called de minimis tests that we might look at while we're working this out. We'll start by looking at 2 of them, known as the simplified tests, which are meant to make it quicker for businesses to see if they can just recover all input tax suffered and not have to do the big process that we will see later on. So you want first of all to check if one of these 2 tests apply. Simplified test number 1 is total input VAT no more than £625 a month on average and exempt supplies no more than 50% of the value of total supplies. Simplified test number 2 is total input VAT less input VAT directly attributable to taxable supplies is no more than £625 a month on average and exempt supplies are no more than 50% of the value of total supplies. Now notice in both of these simplified tests, the second condition there is exactly the same. So if you can spot that that one doesn't apply straight away, you can move on from these simplified tests quite quickly and go through the full partial exemption process that we'll look at shortly. Now, if either one of these simplified tests is true, then the business is allowed to just claim back 100% of the input tax it suffers, regardless of whether it occurred from purchases of goods or services that were to help the business make taxable supplies, exempt supplies, or indeed both. If neither of these simplified tests are met, then we move on to look at a longer process which then involves a third test. The third test is that input VAT relating to exempt supplies is no more than £625 a month and no more than 50% of total input VAT. This third test forms part of a longer process to calculate the input tax recoverable for a business making both taxable and exempt supplies where neither of the 2 simplified tests applied. First of all, we will directly allocate input tax to taxable and exempt supplies as much as possible. So that means if we are told there is an amount of input tax totally to do with taxable supplies, we will put that under taxable. Any input tax we're told is only in connection with purchases to help our business make exempt supplies. We're going to put that amount to exempt supplies. And we will likely then have some input tax suffered by the business that's actually to do with purchases we've made to make both our taxable and our exempt supplies in the business. Now, if you're lucky in the question, you might already be told exactly how much input tax falls under each of these categories. To allocate any residual input tax to either taxable or exempt supplies, we'll use the previous year's input tax recovery percentage or calculate it per quarter. The recovery percentage is worked out by taking the amount of taxable supplies, T, and dividing it by the total amount of supplies, so that's T plus E, with T meaning taxable and E meaning exempt. And then we round this up to the nearest whole percentage. Once we've got this special percentage, we'll use it to apportion the residual pot of input tax between taxable and exempt supplies. And we then will have a check whether the amount we've now decided is irrecoverable input VAT breaches that third de minimis test. And the final step then is basically just deciding what the total amount is of input VAT that we can recover from HMRC. So looking at an example here, we have got a company making supplies for a quarter, taxable supplies of 200,000, exempt supplies of 40,000, and we're told that input VAT to do with taxable supplies is 6,000, input tax totally to do with exempt supplies is 700. Then we've got this residual pot of input VAT to do with some overheads, which is £1,500, and we've to figure out how much input tax this business can recover for this quarter. First of all, we need to check the two simplified tests, because if either of these applies, then we don't need to go through the process of doing that big 5-step process to work out how much input tax is recoverable. So if we look at simplified test number 1, first of all, that's where we are looking to see if total input VAT is no more than 625 a month and exempt supplies are no more than 50% of total supplies. Now in our example, our total input VAT is 6,000 plus 700 plus 1,500, giving us 8,200 altogether. But remember, that was for a quarter, so we need to divide that by 3 to get the monthly average, and you can see that that is more than 625. Therefore, we do not meet the criteria for simplified test number 1. For completeness, I've just included what the exempt supply percentage is at the bottom, which is 17% of total supplies, so that criteria is met. However, we do need both of these criteria to hold true in order to be able to recover all of our input tax regardless of our level of taxable supplies. So we can check our second simplified test then to see if perhaps that one holds true. But again, we can see we meet that second condition about exempt supplies being no more than 50% total supplies, but we fail the first condition, which in this case is that total input VAT less input VAT attributable to taxable supplies is no more than 625 a month. In our example, we end up with 733 a month on average, and therefore we don't meet that condition, and therefore we're going to need to go through that 5-step process to work out how much of the input tax suffered by this company can actually be recovered for the quarter. Now, the first step was to directly attribute input tax to taxable and exempt supplies where possible. Any input tax left is called residual. Now, this was already done for us in the question. The second step was to use the previous year's recovery percentage or work it out per quarter. We weren't given a previous year recovery percentage, so we'll work it out on the basis of the figures we've been given. So we do taxable supplies T divided by total supplies T plus E. So that's 200,000 divided by 240,000, so 83.33 rounded up to the nearest whole percentage, so 84%. What does that actually tell us? That 84% of the supplies in this quarter were taxable. That means 16% were exempt. Now, we apportion residual input tax to taxable and exempt supplies using that percentage, so it means taking the 1,500s of the residual tax, multiply it by 84% to get 1,260. That's attributed to our taxable supplies. The remaining 240 is attributed to our exempt supplies. Now we'll check test 3 to see if we might actually be able to also recover that 240 plus the 700 that was directly attributed to exempt supplies. Test 3 is to check whether input VAT relating to exempt supplies is no more than 625 a month and no more than 50% of total input VAT. The input VAT relating to exempt supplies at £940 a quarter, so 313 a month, so that's less than 625 a month. Check the other condition. We see that 50% of total input VAT for the quarter was 4100, and so £940 is less than that. This means this third test is met, and the consequence is that all input VAT for the quarter, which was 8,200, can be recovered from HMRC. Now, if that hadn't been the case, we'd only be able to recover input tax directly attributable to taxable supplies and has been allocated using the recovery percentage to taxable supplies. The last thing we will look at in this session is the annual adjustment that needs to be done on a partially exempt business to check whether the right amount of input tax has been recovered over a year. So this is performed at the end of a VAT year. We check simplified tests 1 and 2 with the results of the full year. If we meet one of the tests, then no additional recovery or repayment of input tax that's already been recovered is made. If we fail to meet either simplified test, then the full partial exemption calculation needs to be performed, but this time we use the results of a full year. So the full 5-step process using annual figures, and then we see whether any input tax has been over-recovered and needs to be paid back to HMRC, or whether any further input tax can be reclaimed because not enough was recovered during the year. Now, if this session has made you think you need to look again at some of the VAT rules around partial exemption, you can access lots of help in ACCA's free study hub. You'll find notes, flashcards, quizzes, practice questions to help you brush up on these important parts of the ATX syllabus. Make sure you access it throughout your study and revision phases to help you prepare for your exam more effectively. If you're looking specifically for further detail on the topics we discussed today, I recommend you look at Chapter 26 of the Study Hub for ATX. There's a number of sections in there that cover additional aspects of VAT. In particular, you should look at the section on partial exemption rules. There's also a quiz you can do on the content of that chapter in the Study Hub, some short multiple choice questions testing a number of VAT areas, including partial exemption. And exam standard question practice is really important for preparing for your exam. One of the past paper questions in the Study Hub Snowdon has a requirement that looks at a partially exempt business and its implications, so I recommend you try that question once you've done some revision in this area. Thank you for watching. I hope this session on partial exemption for VAT has helped your understanding of this topic and what issues to consider when applying your knowledge to an exam question on this area.